Welcome to our June community call. We've been very busy, so we kind of skipped May, but we have a lot to share today. So, who we are, if in case you're just joining us and this is your first community call, Webrecorder project builds open source tools that specialize in a user-driven form of web archiving, where the user is able to direct the archiving process through their browsers. We have a ton of open source tools, archive web page, replay web page, and our newest one, Browser Tricks Cloud. Our goals for Webrecorder is to focus on advancing open source software development and the research. And so what we believe is web archiving for all. So that being said, Cade, take us away.
Thank you so much. So as probably mentioned in the call, if you've been following the work for the last 6 months or so, we've been doing a research project with Webrecorder, and we're really excited to share this with you today. For the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to go through some of the findings that we've looked at here and everything like that. But before we get started on that, I wanted to just introduce who we are in case there are people on this call who don't know the New Design Congress. And then also just quickly recap like what we're actually doing and what this is all about. So the New Design Congress is a nonprofit strategy and research organization that's a fiscally sponsored project at the moment of an organization called Simply Secure, which is a design-led privacy and digital security and consultancy firm. We have a great degree of autonomy in that place, and we get to work on a series of projects that help us to inform how we see infrastructures as power and technologies as social accelerants. And we believe that this is definitely true in the context of archiving. And so as part of what I hope we can demonstrate today is our core mission and what we try to do, which is to develop these unique understandings of the relationships between societies and their technologies, and then use that to inform, in this case, Webrecorder, the funding group for Protocol Labs, and everybody here on this call today and beyond. We try to inform strategy and policy and product direction in these interventions or these provocations to help affect change within this complex world. And I think in the case of Webrecorder, the timing was quite amazing. We're not going to dive into us. There's a link here to learn more about us, but my name is Cade. I am the founder of the New Design Congress and worked on this research. With me here is Ben.
Hey everyone. So I'm a lead researcher on this project, and some of you recognize me and Cade, obviously, interviewing you over the past few months. And then we've spent the past month combing the findings of the interviews and writing reports, which is in process, work in progress, and we're going to present the findings now.
So before we do that, a small recap. Around the end of last year, Ilya and I started having discussions about we had mutual friends. We started having these discussions about the role of web archiving and some of the motivations behind Webrecorder itself, especially its more democratic and more empowering way of operating versus potentially some of the other tools historically that have been out there. And so over the course of the last 6 months, we've been working with Ilya and Lorena and Ed and the rest of the team to do a set of design-led provocations and support as Webrecorder moves from a very small project to one with a huge degree of potential and support and so on. So our goals in this project have been to not only assist Webrecorder's Waxy spec, and as part of our work is kind of a mixture between design-led political science and sort of threat consultancy, things like that. We feel very privileged that there's an opportunity, which is quite rare, to support a technology at its foundational stage when its specification is being written. And some of the work that we can do in identifying Webrecorder's strengths and opportunities can be fed into the very foundation of the work, of the tools and the specification of the format. We also wanted to help to anticipate potential threats. The world has changed a lot since web recording became a discipline, and we wanted to understand how that had happened and what the differences were. And in doing so, that would really help Webrecorder to get it to know its user base. So alongside the more traditional sense of doing, standard design research. There's this extra element of the complexities and subtleties of the social realities of people archiving or the communities that are subject to archiving. And in doing all of that, what we were hoping to do is to produce design-led recommendations for Webrecorder's tools.
So we split the framework, or the way we address the things that needed to be addressed in the active archiving, which first is identity and structures. And what that means is, what are the use cases for web archiving in the 2020s? What kind of individuals are involved in the broader landscape of digital and web archiving in the 2020s? Well, the motivations of this motivation changed since the last decade. What roles do organizations and institutions play in shaping the policies, the dynamics, and the outcomes of archiving? And what are the historical criticisms of web archiving? Then a second one would be what we call the social technical security. So looking at the overarching threats for archivists, for custodians, for individuals, communities, and organizations subjected to web archiving, for the viewers, both in their access and perception formed by web archive, for archive tools and formats themselves, and for the archive. How are web archiving tools vulnerable to weaponized design? We'll talk a bit more about this later. And our current understanding of baseline risk acceptable? If not, can baseline risk profile be developed? Then we have permission and connectivity. So how do network web archives fit into the use cases identified above? What opportunities and threats emerge as an explicit property of decentralized or resilient network archives? The permission patterns as well. What permission patterns can be identified from a deeper understanding of the topographies of archives, and the whole questions about permission systems and how they dictate the topographies of those network archives. In terms of integrity, we have what opportunities and motivation exists for validating the integrity of an archive. How do these identified cases change when the archive is replicated or decentralized? When is uncertainty in an archive's integrity important? What relationships exist between chain of custody or archive governance and archive integrity? And how do archives influence comprehension? How can this be manipulated? And then one big thing as well was navigation. Everyone is involved in creating those sprawling archives and trying to deal with how to best access them and offer them to end users. And so really, how do current human-computer interactions patterns and or user experience patterns assist or hinder large-scale web archives from the perspectives of archivists, curators, audience, and attacker? Are there opportunities to develop new paradigms for navigating web archives? And what opportunities exist to improve the accessibility of those archives? And then finally, agency. So it looks at what are the implications of user identity within a collaborative networks web archive? Are there, again, opportunities to implement alternative identity paradigms? And this ties in quite nicely with some of the research of the New Design Congress that we done in parallel. What risks exist specific to personal identifying information captured inside a web archive? And again, do opportunities exist to design user agency patterns into archive tools and systems and their format?
Yeah, and so a big part of that too plays a role with the colonial effects of identity and archiving there as well, which is something that we also explored as part of that. And in doing so, alongside a broader literature review and a study of the Webrecorder tooling itself, we conducted 21 interviews, I think, with a couple of that are still curious threads that we'd like to follow up. These were across 8 countries, and we captured maybe nearly 32 hours worth of recordings here. And so it was a very rich set of discussions with a number of different people from different institutions, some from very small places, some from extremely large and well-defined, or places that were very established, and then individuals and other sort of grassroots organizations and things like that too. And so we're super thrilled to share the findings with you today. The first little graph It's just a fun little graph. It doesn't really mean too much in terms of things like market shares or anything like that. But we thought, given the fact that there's a lot of archivists here who use archival tools on a day-to-day basis, we'd just show off the kind of mind share, the tools in that were mentioned during different interviews. Of course, Webrecorder, given that this was a Webrecorder collaboration, and a lot of people were using Webrecorder, that's why they're part of this community. It's overrepresented in this sample. But we found that there's like a wide variety of different tools that people use, and that is distributed with a couple of popular tools and then a whole bunch of other sort of tools that help tailor in different ways the different workflows and support different workflows. But what I think is really interesting about this is how a lot of these tools, with the exception of Webrecorder, are very, very either controlled by a third party, they operate as a service, or they're very technically they require a lot of technical knowledge or training in order to get to use. And that's interesting that those two things are kind of shared amongst the different tool sets for the most part. And so with that, we wanted to start talking about the findings. Benjamin, please. Sorry.
Yeah, so for the first one, the definitions of archiving are broad, but narrowed and flattened by archive tools. So when we were conducting the interviews, we were really impressed by the wealth, the richness of the different definitions of archiving. Sometimes with really interesting contradictions between them. Obviously, it is due to the fact that, I mean, in a way, there are as many philosophies and practice of archiving as there are archivists and custodians, for example. And at the end of the day, archives contribute to the empowerment of social and political minorities. So, for example, in terms of community archiving, the Black Lives Matter movements, collection and rehydration of tweets to document the movement as it was unfolding, or the collaboration between university departments and indigenous projects. So, one thing that struck us, however, was that there was one school of web archiving that held as paramount this ability of archives to replay perfectly the object of the web archiving, that they have to replay a website perfectly as if it had been saved in this pristine condition. And we've encountered other practitioners who thought that maybe that was not the best way to approach the discipline. So again, when we're talking about the tension within archiving, it was interesting to see that expressed to us over the course of those interviews. What seems to arise from the interviews is that the effect that a scope and a budget and the decisions of the archivist obviously will impact the object of archiving, the website, and this already will form and inform the object, the material that is going to be saved. As the quote below states, I know 70 terabytes is a lot, but I don't know how many books that is, how many linear fits that is. It's really difficult to picture in one's head the extent of an archive, and that is kind of the problem of any digitized system of dematerialization. It is just very difficult to have an accurate picture in one's head. Another thing that struck us was the act of archiving flattened the rich interactions of certain digital artifacts. So in this case, the Instagram live videos, but it's applicable to any really that could be a very rich website produced by a museum, for example. The tools have their limitations, and often archivists have to use a combination of tools to cater for limitations. We are going to talk about it a bit later, and this creates a complex set of relations and a complex set of limitations that inform the act of archiving.
The second finding that we found, given once again that this is a collaboration with Webrecorder, even though we did look very broadly, is that Waxy as a format is very well regarded by the people that we spoke with, but its tools are a little bit more polarizing. This isn't necessarily to do with the Webrecorder tool itself in isolation, but rather was reflected as a broad sense of frustration at how the tools come up against or clash up against the definitions of archiving as we described in the previous finding. So participants overall had an excellent opinion of the tools developed by Webrecorder and could see like the trajectory that was there, even if they ran into issues that made them extremely frustrated. We found stories of independent web archivists who talked about how this new generation of tools meant that they could then generate incomes outside of institutions. So that was a really interesting thread. And because of that, it meant that Webrecorder was people were able to start to use it more in a manual way, and then start to like deploy their own archives in that respect. But because parts of the tool work very well, or the tool sets and parts of the tool sets are highly manual and things like that, that then began to bring these frictions in here. And some of those are manifested from some of the further findings here. But overall, we found that in exploring the frustrations that participants had with Webrecorder's UX, we think that a major cause of this is Webrecorder's focus on manual processes, and how in many cases there are different ways in which people came to use Webrecorder. In a lot of cases, it was to either supplement or replace another tool. And in doing so, people were already coming to the tool set with a kind of agitated professional or practice state at that point in time.
Third point, the discovery archivists are overwhelmed by the complexity of what they collect. And that has come again and again, and for a variety of reasons. The main one is, as stated earlier, there's a lot of difference between the tools, between their limitations, but unfortunately that means that archivists have to be good at mastering multiple tools to cover for their respective shortcomings, and also to exploit the things that those tools are very good at handling. So it is both in a way a strength and a weakness. It forces archivists to be to explore a lot more different mental models of those tools, but also that means spreading their competency across a collection of tools that can be supported a little bit haphazardly. Something that we also discovered is that the tools might have in turn reinforced the practice of mass harvesting, what we call mass harvesting or broad crawling, right? So the technical capacities that arose over the past, let's say, 10 years, 15 years, that is actually quite new, have sort of created this dynamic, this self-sustaining, where tools allow for this broad crawling, and then broad crawling is done, and then informed tools creation. Tools have to become even better at broad crawling. And that creates a situation where multiple participants noted that the field of web archiving, especially among the biggest institutions, treat the web as one soup of URL and time that is the same for everyone. This is a flattening, as we said, about this flattening of rich digital artifact, rich material. It becomes this collection of URL that is really difficult to navigate, and that is just a little bit acontextualized in a way. And some people have talked about the Eritrix model, which informs this tendency, how it really works at scale, but it's kind of sloppy. We have a very interesting quote here where participants talk about how a whole archive is like a lake. It's really difficult to gauge the depth of it, and there are multiple entries that you could take in this sort of volume of water, which we found was really interesting.
The fourth finding here, once we determined the broad range of entry points, as Benjamin talked about, like these metaphors of lakes, or the kind of the ability for these tools to collect large amounts of information that then needs to be sorted, we found that introducing decentralized technology into the current ecosystem would be very dangerous. At New Design Congress, we've written extensively about the dangers of decentralized technology. This is in these findings specifically because one of the plans or potential futures explored by the Webrecorder team, and indeed other archival groups themselves, is to turn to decentralized solutions in order to ensure that archives have a degree of resiliency and that costs can be lowered in certain circumstances, amongst other reasons why you would do this. However, what we found was that there are these differing levels of awareness of collective institutional power that archivists wield when they confront communities. and everybody within that they might collaborate with in that point at that point in time. And what we mean by this is that when people have the safety of an institution around them, it can become difficult unless you're very, very careful and very self-aware to understand how your risk profile is different to an external person's risk profile. This is very, very true when it comes to just even the act of archiving and archiving communities and things like that. And a lot of discussion has been had around, say, for example, the roles of some of the decisions, for example, of archive team. Now, it's not the place to talk about that. I'm using this as a shorthand to talk about the differences in perspective between risk between archivists, for example, and communities that are archived. But introducing decentralized technologies then expands that to collaborators in a very particular way. One way that happens is through working with people on archiving political movements or social movements, which can draw attention to archivists. And then if they're in a decentralized context, there's some people who have the safety of institutions and some people who don't, and there's a discrepancy there. But also from an actual holding of material. So we spoke to a number of participants who, either from legislative perspective or from the institutional policy, actually don't delete content that they capture. And so in these cases, instead of deleting material that may be offensive, hate speech, illegal in the jurisdiction that they're working in, instead of deleting those, they tend to mark them as inactive or inaccessible and create a dark archive as a result. And while that can be protected under an institution, and while there might be legislation that does protect the institution in that context, a decentralized archive with other individuals in other locations geographically, whether they're in an institution or as an individual, may not enjoy that same protection. And so the duality of the active archiving in a decentralized way and the risks associated with that, alongside the governing or the custodianship of a decentralized archive, create these unequal risk profiles that have really not been explored very well so far in a policy sense, either from tool makers or from institutions.
Then we have the consequences of crawlers and archive tools on what is archived and how it is viewed. And by that, we also include the institutions like the Internet Archive or the social media platforms directly that are used sometimes to supplement a crawl that was not complete. Obviously, sometimes this is compulsory. There's no to worry about it, but it also is important to question what is driving an entity like the Internet Archive and also an entity like Twitter, Facebook, and what leads them to present information in a specific way, and what they get from collaborations like that, and what is driving the documenting of archives through their eye and their own act of archiving. And participants were broadly appreciative of these relationships, but they are also concerned about changes in those institutions, right? So what happened after Internet Archive's leadership retires, or if there's, some people have said like an accident, like what happened if within an archive department, a leader of a project retires or change job, and then someone else who has a different vision intervene. How does that shape the relation with potentially communities that are being archived, indigenous people or targeted communities, right? So the second thing is that web archives are wholly dependent on a constant tension between the whims of internet technologies, as we said, the technical potentials that have formed over the past 10, 15 years, and the abilities of tools. And we noted that a lot of participants, as we said earlier, were a bit frustrated with the fact that digital medium seems to be inferior in many ways to physical archives. It's despite the fact that digital archive is supposed to be those or digital medium are supposed to be this hyperlinked, connected, full of metadata. They are actually very difficult to connect to actual things, or like the technical infrastructure that would be needed to have this web of connection, this really rich web of connection for access, is just so expensive and so resource intensive that it's just not really easy to do, and it's just starts to be just an accumulation of data. And obviously we have further complexities brought by video medium. For example, you can imagine in the near future, or even right now, streaming platform, how to archive that. We're talking about Instagram live videos, for example. So there's a lot of limitations and drive from those technological and technical potential.
So just noting for time, we might move a little bit faster with these. So number 6, navigating digital archives is difficult and proposed solutions may not address the problem. This is quite straightforward. I think anybody on this call who deals with a large archive could understand how navigating these systems is very difficult. We found that there are 2 main ways people do this. One is either through manual navigation systems, like having a complementary spreadsheet, or using tagging, which is a highly manual process. And then the other is to use URL-based entry points or annotation signposts embedded inside archive materials. And what we found, though, is as we spoke to people, we discovered that some of the assumptions that we'd had in the previous round of conversations, both in our broader research of archival tools and this particular work with Webrecorder, some of the things that we thought would actually work out of the box to help alleviate this issue. A lot of people that we spoke to when we presented this, when we had the opportunity to present it to a participant, would say, oh, we've tried stuff like this before, and actually it created more problems. So an example would be full text search. When you add full text search into a large archive, one thinks that it may help to alleviate that, but when we spoke to participants who had gone through that process, they basically said that it made their lives more overwhelming, not less. So there's a massive opportunity to figure out how to navigate digital archives and build interfaces for them.
The impact of traumatic material, that is pretty straightforward here. Obviously, archiving involves looking or doing QA on a lot of materials that can incorporate violence, crimes, unethical, immoral materials, or just difficult materials. Harvesting data on COVID is pretty grim. There's also the fact that the workload keeps increasing, even though the budgets allocated to departments is I think you're well aware, is not following the workload. And there's also the trauma generated by sometimes awkward practices or maybe not taking into account the safety of indigenous communities that are documented, are archived, whose practices are archived. So there's a lot of things here to explore about the security that a format could influence and reducing the area of attacks.
Archive tools use colonial methodology, and Indigenous expertise is missed. We were very fortunate to speak to a number of perspectives from outside of the colonialist mindset of archival, which is born from a multi couple hundred years science or academic practice of archiving. And this manifests in a number of ways. Given that we only have an hour or 30 minutes to really talk about this, we won't be able to go deep into this. One of the places that has a lot of promise, because when we spoke to people who exist and whose experiences are outside of the dominant ways of understanding what digital and web archiving should be, what we found is that people had a lot of they could very easily and very cogently describe how their experiences create friction with the tools themselves, but then also oftentimes had perspectives or approaches that could be incorporated or have input and influence into a new generation of tools that would also go towards solving some of the other issues that we've talked about here, some of the other findings so far. And so we're really excited about this one in particular because it seems like there's a rich post-colonial collaboration or series of collaborations that could happen as a result of exploring with these communities and with this expertise the alternative ways of doing things, these sort of ways which we could fork the trajectory of what we see today.
Then the collection of the collection of threats and vulnerabilities that face current archive practices. we have encountered a lot of talks about trying to map risk for an archive, how it can be destroyed, how it can be targeted, especially among government bodies, and it's all well and good. I think there were two main things that were missing. We feel from what we heard. One is what we call weaponized design, and weaponized design is when a system works exactly as it's intended, but it can be used to harm communities, and so it's a very tricky thing to assess, because again, this is exactly how it's supposed to use, but it's actually causing damages. So, for example, incentivized adversaries can account for complexity. Intelligence and police department can absolutely spend millions of dollars sifting or using technology that sift automatically through archives, while archives, which are mass harvests, are unusable for or really difficult to access for end users. So the assumption that large unwieldy archives are inherently safer in a way is we feel a dangerous position. The other facet is that obviously archives can be a victim of government, right? Like the example we have here is the archives of the colonization of Kenya, which after the decolonization of Kenya, after the massacre of the Mau Mau revolts, the archives were just burned by the British government. So risk assessment is all well and good, but when it comes from inside or from the top, it's often we would say ignored. We really want those to be kept in mind in further conversation about the political and ecological threats.
So the last two here kind of link together a little bit, and I think we'll try to sort of cover them both together. Archive integrity systems that we've talked about, the idea of making a system harder to forge, so harder to manipulate a digital archive. These have very interesting and unknown second and third order consequences. And this is where we're talking about these weaponization side of things, where the risk of misuse of archives in projects like the ICE Dragnet or other government systems is enhanced by having an archive that has an integrity system inside it. But at the same time, the flip side of that too is that it has negative consequences on the practice of archive itself. The idea of archivists using the ability to change an archive has positive consequences too, to help sustain or make an engaging archive. And that's often not really taken into account when we talk about building systems that use cryptography to validate an archive. And just to sort of wrap this up here a little bit, because I do want to make some time, and I know that there's only 20 minutes left here. Thank you so much for being with us so far. Is this final point, which is after 20 years of stability, the threats to the archival projects are now very suddenly here. And this is really the core of the project. It's both from the information overwhelming nature, but then also the collection of crises that are arising: climate change, the deteriorating political situation of the United States, the deployment of surveillance infrastructure worldwide disguised as pandemic response, and most recently the unjustified war in Ukraine, which when we started this hadn't actually, that war had not been declared. We have 20 years of history of digital and web archival systems with assumptions baked into them that do not match this reality anymore. And so Webrecorder sits, we believe, in a position where it actually stands to, with deep consideration in its design, actually be one of the tools that begins to respond to this emerging world that we find ourselves in. So we're going to pause here for questions. There is a little bit extra to talk about what happens next on the immediate next couple of weeks. I would like to just quickly move to some of the questions here. Unfortunately, when some of the answers will be a little bit unsatisfying because they make up part of the report. There's a lot of discussion around decentralized technologies, which I'll start with first. And essentially what we found is that the risk is twofold. One is realized where something is seen inside an archive that's illegal, and then a police agency or other enforcement group is then able to trace the ownership of that through a system. And the problem is that because a number of participants that we spoke to work at institutions that deploy a more sort of indiscriminate collection policy, that then the fact that when you combine that with an inability to manage these large data sets, you end up with archives that have very rich and very justified reasons for existing, but struggle to maintain, curate, or otherwise defend themselves against material that puts them at risk. And when you have an institution, those institutions are typically a little bit better shielded from the consequences of that than, say, an individual might be. There's also social graphing concerns as well, which we kind of touched on before about like the collaborations between individuals and groups as they move through and try to map out, say, a social event or a political movement. In that case, if that decentralized network can then be discovered and its relationships uncovered, then the association between organizations and individuals can come under scrutiny. I mean, we've seen this countless times in the context of harassment campaigns against, say, sort of feminist work or anti-fascist work and things like that. And there's a question here from a member here that talks about the observations of like unequal risks being brought by archivists themselves. I just want to note that that's a really good question, and that there's a more detailed answer to that question inside the report. But what I just described here about like the tension points between individual safety and institutional safety, and the relationships that exist both within an institution and then through collaboration, is an example of those kinds of things, let alone the tension points between archivists and the communities or movements that they archive, and some of the kinds of risks that emerge from that both groups can see in that when it's actually happening. In terms of, there's another question here just quickly too about the Waxy format. Once again, we are overrepresented in terms of Webrecorder, being that this is the Webrecorder project, being that the study was in the invites were put out by Webrecorder. There is an overrepresentation of Webrecorder and Waxy in the participants, because there are people already from this community. Not everybody was. We actually interviewed much broader than that, but there is a sample. Like you cannot derive from this work that that Waxy is more visible than it actually is, because of that overrepresentation in the work. We have one, the risks for decentralized tech in space different than those that already exist in web archives in general, though. Yes, they do. The risks are very different in the sense that when you have a centralized technology, especially around institutions, even in cases where an institution is working with a freelancer, the social contracts and the legal contracts that are made as a part of like the employment of that individual, even if they exist outside of the institution, has a much greater weight than that collaboration happening in a very decentralized way. And so there's a centralized, institutionalized system has benefits around legal resources, support, even things like healthcare, the ability to provide healthcare in the United States for people who are employed by that institution, which can then have like a follow-on effect to help people cope with the acts of like harassment or potential threats. All of these are examples that once you introduce decentralization into it, you can no longer rely on them as being equal for different people who are participating within that archive. Benjamin, did you want to add anything to that? I just sort of tore through some of these questions, knowing that we've only got really 15 minutes left. Please leave some questions here as well. Benjamin.
No, I think I'd rather have time for people asking questions. I think maybe to continue talking while maybe people are writing questions. I think what's important to address is like all the findings that we had, they really come from within the archive community and the people around the archive community who've been involved in archiving projects. So there is an understanding, there is a realization of all those issues, those frictions, and it's overall quite healthy in a way to see them surfaced.
I'm dropping in the chat a foundational text that we published in 2020 that describes the general risks associated with decentralization. This doesn't go into the detail of of the issues specific to web archiving, but it does sort of talk a little bit about general issues around centralization versus decentralization. That's in the chat now. So what we'll do, there's another space for QA. Given that the chat is a bit silent again, I would just jump on to the next steps so that we can allow people to ask some more questions. The main thing here is that we are publishing the report Memory in Uncertainty in the next couple of weeks. We have agreements in place with the participants that they have a final say on how they're represented when they're published. So we need to go through that process there and make sure that we represent everybody ethically. So subject to final consent approval from the participants and the discussion with Ilya and Ed and Lorena and the rest of the Webrecorder team, that determines the final publication date. So look out for that. We'll be publishing it on newdesigncongress.org and also in partnership with Webrecorder as well.
And then, as obviously, we want to help the Webrecorder team in the next month and years with recruitment, with design specs, trying to inform the way as we said, area of attacks, security concerns, interfaces can be addressed, and obviously inform the Waxy specs going forward.
And then finally, we have a broader research and strategic roadmap for digital archiving in unstable and uncertain contexts. And so what we're kind of hoping off the backs of this research and some other related work that we've been doing at New Design Congress is that this report and this collaboration helps to support a series of opportunities that can broaden institutional understanding of the challenges and opportunities of archival practice in many forms, primarily digital and primarily web as well. And so we're sort of looking at this work, not just in the immediate benefit for Webrecorder and its team, but also how we can systematize this to an extent or how we can recontextualize it or give it use or relevance to different groups within these spaces and expand our knowledge a little bit further. You can support the research as well. If this is of any interest, we are, as I said, independent. So if you find this work really interesting and you're interested in becoming an individual supporter, we do have an open collective and we're looking at decentralizing our funding quite a bit as part of this. If you're an institution and you want to provide support or even collaborate on like these kinds of research topics and hear more about the roadmap that we're working on, you can send us an email. But then also, if you would like to track our progress in general, there's a Substack that you can sign up to. We post our newsletters fairly infrequently, but we'll publish this report plus all of the subsequent work that we do, both on newdesigncongress.org and also obviously release it through our collaborators and also through our own newsletter. With that, I'm moving back to Q&A, and Ilya has written here that wouldn't decentralization also mitigate some of the other risks, such as addressing the colonial mindset in archiving and political or ecological risks, or could it?
I could take this one.
Yeah, I was going to throw that to you. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's important to always properly address what one means by centralization and decentralization, because there's a tendency maybe to turn some words into what we call floating signifiers, right? Like they sort of lose their meaning over time because they use, and people are quite excited about the potential. But decentralization, at the end of the day, is not bulletproof against colonization. It's not a bulletproof solution against colonization. Colonization acted with decentralized mode of hierarchies since the beginning. One could say that the Pilgrims, for example, at the first stages of the America's colonization, was a form of decentralized. They were sent because they were political refugees, and they settled the lands, and that gave they had a relative autonomy until they hadn't, because obviously there's always if we're not aware, there's always hierarchies and centralized power that reform around decentralized networks, in this case, or decentralized organizations. So it's neither centralization is bad and all good, or decentralization is bad and all good. It's really understanding when we're trying to make a decentralized system, what are the political implications, what are the power relations in this system, and being quite honest about them.
Yeah, and that forms a large part of our work as well. We've looked at everything from how the design of different kinds of protocols can facilitate different kinds of governance structures that are inherent in the protocol designs, all the way through to this work around sort of threat and understanding the risks associated with decentralization versus centralization. So there's a broad range of research that we're drawing from when we talk about this. And I'm a little bit, almost feel like we could talk for an entire hour just on this topic alone. And it's clearly of interest to the people on this call. So yeah, thank you for the collection of questions around that, both from a risk perspective, but also from how decentralization could help. I want to make it super clear based off what Benjamin was just saying too, is that we are not proposing that that decentralization should not be explored, rather that we feel that the current engineering-based approach to decentralization has these types of limitations that are not often talked about in engineering or design circles. And so it's about, firstly, really understanding those concerns and like really feeling out those risks and seeing what those risks look like in different contexts, and then working with tool builders and institutions to then mitigate those before they become a problem.
An example would be talking to activists who are involved with targeted communities and natives in the Americas. For example, a centralized solution for those communities' data and archiving of cultural practices is better if this centralized system is in the hand of the community based on a democratic decision process, rather than having a sprawling decentralized system that is spread across various institutions or non-governmental organizations and other communities, where suddenly information is synchronized and can be accessed, and the surface of attack is much wider and can be used by attackers.
Ilya is asking a question: what was the most surprising thing we've heard, the most surprising finding? I'm going to answer this in one line. I challenge Benjamin to do that too in one line. For me, it was the proliferation, like the sheer number of people we spoke to who don't have deletion policies. As somebody who has done a lot of this like research into the risks, the lack of deletion policy and how prevalent it was makes a lot of sense, but it was also very shocking as to how widespread that practice was. That was it for me.
Oh God, it's my time. In
Yeah.
one go. I think overall is the friction I've sensed between, and I addressed that earlier, between a strong sense of understanding probably some of the most complex matters, the most and sometimes problematic matters, or the limitation of the discipline, here understood as a very monolithic entity, but which obviously the discipline isn't. So a realization of all of that, but as though maybe there were concerns or hesitations, or maybe there's also an inertia in confronting them. So there's good and bad to really simplify things, right? Like we again and again in interviews, there's a sense that things could be better, things should be addressed, but as though maybe again institutional inertia there or habits, or simply because archivists are in the trenches and they just have to, they need to save things every day, and there's already a lot of workload, and things maybe are just piling up, and issues are put on the back of everyone's mind. So maybe that was the most surprising in a sense.
Yeah. Just to respond to the question here in the chat, I don't think many Americans have a grasp of the many different types of threat models for people in relation to archives generally. I think that hampers understanding how different threat models would work as part of decentralized regimes, which seem attractive for a variety of reasons. Yeah, that's I think the main point that we have found more broadly in this work. And we come at this from understanding, yeah, as I said before, decentralization as a part of a broader tool set. So thank you for that comment very much. We have 2 more minutes left, so I do want to hand it over for those announcements if there's any to Lorena and to Ilya, but to everybody here on this call and everybody who's watching on YouTube after the call is archived, and to everybody who's participated, to the funder, to Ilya, to Ed, to Lorena, to the whole team. Thank you so much for working with us on this. This started as a curiosity related to some of the work that we've been doing, and I think I speak for both Benjamin and myself. We are really, really thrilled with the research. There's so many interesting threads as part of it, and we feel like it's more of a starting point rather than delivering something that's in any way final. So thank you again for the opportunity to work on that. And with that, I want to pass it over to Lorena. Thank you.
Yeah, Kate, thank you so much for all of this information. I look forward to reading the report. And to all of you, thank you for joining us and learning with us. And I really do like that point you made where this isn't just a wrap up deliverable, it's a starting point. And hopefully we can continue this conversation either on chats, at a conference like IIPC, which just passed, or even on our forum, because this is something that is very important. And it is something that Webrecorder also wants to expand on. So if you want to work with us, we're looking for a community support engineer, specifically to support the Sutro community, and we're looking for backend engineers. Currently, a lot of the weight goes on Ilya, and I kind of work on documentation. So please join us, expand our team.
Oh, yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lorena. Yeah, thank you so much for yeah. I also wanted to add thank you so much, Kate and Benjamin, for this report. Yeah, this was really fascinating. Some surprising findings, but that's kind of part of why we have research is to learn exactly what the big picture is. So thank you again, and we'll continue working together on this. So very much looking forward to the report.
Yeah. And I'm going to be sending out the link that Jessica just put in the chat. And if anyone has articles or their own writings that they have on this topic or on web archiving, please share. We're creating our resources like library so folks can know where to start with web archiving, like Web Archiving 101, and more details of how one to do a workflow or specific issues exactly that like we're talking about. So please share, will help share alike. And thank you again for joining us. It's been a pleasure.